ישלח לרב רפואה שלמה מן השמיים לכל הפצועים, ייתן עצה טובה למנהיגינו, ייתן אחדות ואהבה בתוכנו, ונאמר
Hey, so last night we started talking about Purim Mishulash, which is coming up. It's talking about reading the huh? Last night. Yeah. It was upstairs. It was upstairs. We're talking about reading the Megillah on Shabbos, or not reading the Megillah on Shabbos. Okay. All right. So if anybody doesn't remember, apparently there are some, that's why we have the Shiurim up on YouTube, so it's okay. It's on Purim that you're meant to drink, right, that you can't remember anything, not before. But anyway, so, okay. But we started talking about reading the Megillah on Shabbos. Now, we know in our fixed calendar, Yud Daled, which is Purim in most places in the world, and the non-walled cities, right, Yud Daled will not fall on Shabbos. However, Tetvav, which is Purim de Mukafim, and we have Purim de Prazim, Purim de Mukafim, Shushan Purim, or whatever you want to call it, which Yerushalayim, to the best of my knowledge, is probably the only city in the world that celebrates Purim on Tetvav as a Vadai. Chevron, also? Vadai or Safek? So, okay, so there's a lot of... so they do right. There are places where they would do sometimes 2 days or out of Safek that maybe it was a walled city in the time of Yoshua ben Nun. We're not sure all of the places if it's the same city that it was back then, if it's the same location. Last year, interesting questions started to come up about if there are Chayalim in Gaza and maybe in Lebanon and different places there, which might fall under that category as well. Okay, but in any event, the point is that Tet Vav falls out this year on Shabbat. So what happens when Purim falls on Shabbat? We can't actually fulfill many of the mitzvot of Purim on Shabbat. So we either bring them forward to Friday or we postpone them till Sunday. And again, we'll talk in more detail on Sunday morning in the Shiur about that. But we're talking specifically about the Megillah. So question number one is, why is it that we don't read the Megillah on Shabbat? Right? There's nothing, seemingly we could have done it. So we explained last night 2 reasons brought in the Bavli, a third in the Yerushalmi. But essentially the Bavli says, Rabbah says that we have a Gzeirah, Shema Yitlenu Avamot B'Reshut Rabim. Right, same thing by shofar, same thing by lulav. We don't want to, a person may come to carry in Reshut Rabim and transgress Shabbat, transgress the Malacha of Hotza'ah, and therefore we don't fulfill the mitzvah on Shabbat. The other reason which is brought is Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef says, and again, he may be arguing with Rabbah, or he may be in other words, Mikra Megillah we associate together with Matanot Evyonim, and all the Evyonim, all the Aniyim are waiting when we read the Megillah to get their money. But you obviously can't do that on Shabbat, and therefore we don't read on Shabbat. Now, a question that comes up as a result of all of this is, which is the real Purim? Right? Which is really the day? What do I mean? In other words, there's 2 ways of looking at this. When we say that really the original takana was that the Megillah is read on Yud Daled in all the open cities, and it's read on Tetvav in the walled cities. And the Mishnah talks about Kfarim and other places and the days they would read. So we're saying now that in a year when Tetvav falls on Shabbat, we cannot read the Megillah on Shabbat. We read it on Friday instead. So there's 2 ways of looking at this. It could be, option number 1 is, when Anshe Knesset Gdolah made the original decree, the original enactment of when to read the Megillah, they established it was a sort of a 2-tier system, permutations. They established that you should read it on Tetvav, but if Tetvav falls out on Shabbat, you should actually read it on Friday. In other words, this was built in, this was part of the original takana. Or there's a second way of looking at it, which is, no, the takana was Tetvav. Tetvav is Tetvav. Later on, came Chachamim and said, well, hang on a second, if Tetvav falls out, you tell it for that matter as well. But if it falls out on Shabbat, we're not going to fulfill the original takana of reading it on that day, and we're going to read it on Friday instead. Okay, what's the difference between it? Maybe it sounds like the same thing, but there are going to be a number of implications, a number of nafkaminas between these two understandings. Let me read to you. The Turei Even, in his commentary to Megillah, is the one who asked this question, and what he comes out with is something very, very interesting. So he says like this. He says, Le Rabba, okay, remember, the first reason was Rabba who said that we're worried that you might come to carry Arba Amot Barashot Rabim. In other words, the reason you don't read the Megillah on Shabbat is because that might cause an Isur. We want to prevent people from transgressing. So he says like this. According to Rabba, the reason we don't read the Megillah on Shabbat is because somebody somewhere might come to transgress Shabbat. Okay, spoke about that a bit last night. We can say the following: Chachamim achronim tiknu b'chal b'Shabbat lahagdim ne'erev Shabbat. In other words, not the original Beit, not the original Anshe Knesset Gdolah. There's an implicit question here, and the implicit question is, if originally the takana was made that the Megillah has to be read on Tetvav Bo Bayom, how can a later Beit Din come along and uproot a takana of a previous Beit Din? The Gemara on the same daf says only if a later Beit Din is greater in Minyan and is greater in Chokhmah, then they come along. So he says like this. He says Chachamim achronim tiknu b'chal b'Shabbat lakdim ne'erev Shabbat. Says to Rabbi, it's not a problem according to Rabbah, because later on Chachamim can come and they can say we're going to read the Megillah earlier. Even though one Beit Din can't come along and uproot a previous Beit Din if it was greater in number and in stature, etc. He says, that's when do we say that? We say that when you want to come along and you want to make a decree for whatever reason. But if there's an Isur, if you're making a fence to protect people from an Isur, well, there we know. He says, so Chachamim can come along and they can passively uproot something from the Torah, all the more so, can't do this nowadays, but all the more so that they can uproot, at least passively, something that an earlier Beit Din made. What's the example? We spoke last night. Tkiyat Shofar. Tkiyat Shofar on Shabbat, right? Chachamim come along and say, according to Rabbah, that what? We're not going to blow the shofar on Shabbat because we're concerned about A, B, and C. But the Torah said you have a chiyuv. You have a chiyuv to go and blow the Torah and to blow the shofar on Shabbat. So we say no, they're nullifying it. B'shei b'al ta'aseh. They can do that. They can do that if they're concerned about isurim, etc. So we say the same thing over here. דעה שופר ולולב, שעל תורה נמי ביטלו בשבת, משום הגזרה דרבא גופי, ולא עדיף מגילה מהן. In other words, okay, and this is the first way of looking at it, the first understanding. So according to Rabbah, the reason we have no problem of a later Beit Din coming along and changing, nullifying whatever the decree of the earlier Beit Din. Why? Because they're doing it to protect us from Isur. They're doing it to protect us from the Isur of carrying the Megillah on Shabbat. In other words, the original decree was you read the Megillah on Tetvav, even if it's on Shabbat. Later on, okay, if it's Shabbat, so the decree is to read it on Shabbat, but we are bringing it forward. Okay, that's one perspective. The second perspective is this. The Torah even continues. He says, Aval Rav Yosef. According to Rav Yosef, now again, the reason that Rav Yosef gave was nothing to do, not to protect us from Isur. It's connected to the fact of the Aniyim, Einayim Nesuot, right? He says, the Ein Krim Megillah B'Shabbat Mesha Einayim Sha'aniyim Nesuot L'Mekra Megillah, Bar Kochenu. So then we have to say this. Bar Kochenu, Anshe Knesset Gdolah Atzman, Tiknu Lahakdim Haitam. We have to say that part of the original enactment that the Anshe Knesset Gdolah said, when they said Megillah is read on Tetvav, it's read on Tetvav, unless Tetvav is on Shabbat, in which case it's read on Friday. In other words, according to the first way we said the real Purim, so to speak, is Shabbat. But because of an external reason, we can't read the Megillah on Shabbat, so we'll read it on Friday. According to the second perspective, say no, the real day, the Bo Bayom on which you have to read the Megillah is actually Friday, is actually the day before. So what's the difference? What's the nafkamina that's going to come out of this? Why does it matter? So the first one, maybe, the first question is this: when we say that reading the Megillah is not a mitzvah d'oraita, okay, because it's not is it a mitzvah d'Rabbanan? So there are those Rishonim who say yes, and there are those Rishonim who say it's a little bit more than a mitzvah d'Rabbanan. Okay, if you look in the Gemara and the way it establishes, it says the Nevi'im came along and established. So what we call, many of the Rishonim call it Divrei Kabbalah. There are many different levels. The truth is, in between Doraita and Rabbanan, and Rav Shavais once gave a share. He came up, I think, 13 different categories in between Doraita and Rabbanan. You can go through and you can see them. One of them is Divrei Kabbalah. Divrei Kabbalah has a certain status. It's a little bit higher than, maybe a lot higher than a Drabanan. So, but that would only be if it was part of the original decree. So, if we say that, what we said, the second explanation, according to Rav Yosef, that when the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah established Divrei Kabbalah, the time to read the Megillah, they said it was on Tetvav and maybe on Yudalet because it falls out this year. So that still has the status of Divrei Kabbalah. If we say no, if we say the original decree was that it has to be on Tetvav, and later on we said, well, there's external considerations. Tetvav might be Shabbat, you might come to carry, therefore you're reading on your Dalet. So then, according to that understanding, your chiyuv is not Divrei Kabbalah, but your chiyuv is Midrabanan, which is a lower level. The difference of that is, can somebody, this is going to be the big nafka mina, can somebody who is from a era prazim, right, somebody who's not in Yerushalayim, this year we're all reading the Megillah at the same time, but can somebody who is actually celebrating Purim bona fide on Yud Daled read the Megillah for somebody who's actually celebrating Purim on Tetvav? So you say, why not? We're both, in a normal year, it's a big question because you have a different chiyuv. But this is exactly the point. If the chiyuv is identical, which means it was part of the original decree, and then both have the chiyuv on Divrei Kabbalah, then it's fine, then there's no problem. However, if we say that actually the Megillah should have been read according to the original decree, the original Divrei Kabbalah should have been on Tetvav, but only later on Rabbah came along and said, actually, we don't read on Shabbat, we read it the day before. So then the one has a chiyuv, which is Divrei Kabbalah, and one has a chiyuv, which is Drabanan, and it's a different level chiyuv, and then you would not be able to be motzi one or the other. Where do we find this? We find this in many places. This is the reason, by the way, why a katan cannot be motzi a gadol in Kiddush or in whatever mitzvah, because his chiyuv is only midrabanan, whereas his chiyuv is doraita. Okay, so that's one of the nafkamina. Lamaise, what do we say? It's best practice is that you should have a ben krach to be motzi a ben krach or a ben ir to be motzi a ben ir. But if it's not possible, if it's not, there are those opinions that say it's okay, is what to rely on. But lekatchila should be avoided. Okay, Rabbi Hanania ben Akash, Shamer Zakar Bachur Zakot Yisrael, Bechach Ba'alem Torah Mitzvot, Shneimad Rach V'Tzman Tzikho Yagdir Torah.